history of Jacksonville begins most appropriately with the history of the St. Johns River, because the history of our great city is the history of the river. Geologists tell us that our natural history began over 5 million years ago, so we have a very long history indeed. And during this time, the St. Johns was drowned many times over by the Atlantic Ocean, so that we might say that we ourselves, this land and this river, are children of the Atlantic. Because of this flooding, the magnificent river does not have the characteristics of other old winding rivers. Instead, it can be better described as a series of coastal lagoons, linked one after another like great pearls on a thin chain. Into this type of environment came the first known inhabitants, the Paleo-Indians, or the ancient ones, some 16,000 years ago.
The story of the ancient ones is the story of small nomadic hunting parties coming onto the peninsula to stalk prey, coming into Florida along the trails which form US 1 today. These bands of Indians camped along the riverbanks at places where animals gathered and crossed. Camping on the high ground in the vicinity of what is now Liberty Street, they set up traps and waited for the animals to cross the river. The Indians, of course, did not know that the source of this magnificent river system could be found nearly 300 miles south, in a tiny area called Blue Cypress Lake. With humble beginnings, this mighty river flows north from what is now Lake Wilmington, through Lake George and Lake Monroe, before it empties into the Atlantic Ocean. It is one of the few major rivers in the world which runs north. The name of this mighty river changed according to the inhabitants along its banks. Some of the earliest settlers living at the mouth appropriately called it Walatka, or River of Lakes. Because of the frequent floodings, many shorelines were dotted with bluffs, which later served as boat landings. The first European intrusion into this land was by French Huguenots traveling up the coast from the south, seeking a place to found a new France. More than half a century before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, Captain Jean Ribault braved the passage across the bar from the Atlantic Ocean to the river. According to some accounts, the waters at the mouth of the river lifted as high as 50 or 60 feet during high tide. Ribault and his men crossed the bar in small boats, and on May 1st, 1562, offered a prayer of thanks, claiming the land for King Charles of France. Ribault named the river Rivière de Mai, or the River May, marking the date of this significant passage. Huguenot colonists then began building Fort Caroline, which became the first significant European settlement in this new land. The next 250 years witnessed a clash of nations, seeking dominance over the river and over the lands it passed through. Following their settlement in St. Augustine, the Spanish became interested in this area, destroyed the French fort, and renamed Fort Caroline San Mateo.
One of the glories of our history, and there are many, is the work of Father Francisco Pareja, whose mission, San Juan del Puerto, was on present-day Fort George Island. Father Pareja, a gifted linguist, listened carefully to the language of the Timucua Indians who were his charges. He wrote it down, created a grammar, and wrote several theological works which were later printed in Mexico City. When these books were returned to Fort George Island, the Indians learned to read them, learned to write in their own language, and were soon writing letters to themselves as well as to the King of Spain. The irony of all of this is that the language was the oldest existing language on the North American continent, at least 8,500 years old. It literally had its back to the sea, surrounded as it was by Muskogean dialects. It was the first language to be systematically written down in the New World, and the oldest.
Spain continued to dominate the land for the next 150 years. Sometime in the mid-18th century, the name of the river begins to appear on maps as San Juan. From a 16th century Indian missionary settlement, San Juan del Puerto, on present-day Fort George Island, we get the name San Juan or St. John. It is not known why the Indian village was named for St. John or when it was named, but it is the name of the river which remains. British involvement began in Florida in 1733, when General Oglethorpe landed in Georgia, established Savannah, and almost immediately began to move south. He built Fort George and began moving down the east coast toward St. Augustine, capturing Spanish forts and claiming the land for England. But he never captured St. Augustine. Characteristic of his nature, Oglethorpe engaged in battles until he seemed to tire of them. Before reaching his goal, he stopped his ventures, saying that hurricane season was coming and that it was time to go home. The British withdrew from Florida. Although the Spanish maintained sentinel posts and fortifications on the St. Johns, the river remained quiet for more than 2 decades. Ironically, it was a peace treaty, not a battle or war, which returned Florida to the British. Spain ceded Florida to Great Britain in order to regain Havana. At that time, Florida stretched all the way from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It completed the southern portion of the 13 colonies, so the British took this land eagerly. They subsequently divided it into 2 provinces, East and West Florida. A line was drawn on a map beginning at the St. Mary's River, with everything to east belonging to the English and everything west going to the Seminoles. James Grant was appointed the first royal governor of this province. In 1764, Governor Grant signed a proclamation encouraging settlers to come to East Florida by offering a number of land grants. Within a very short time, a number of plantations had sprung up along the river, rivaling the Spanish settlements of an earlier period. One of the significant accomplishments of the British was the construction of the King's Road along the high places between South Georgia and into Florida. This road became the main line of commerce. On this road, various trips were made by the 2 Bartrams, William and John, who came into Florida to study the flora and fauna and to beautifully chronicle the wild and wondrous sights. The King's Road crossed the St. Johns River at a narrow point called the Cowford.
The Cowford, a place where cattle could cross or ford the river. A rather uninspiring name for a place, to be sure, but it was actually at that point, that narrow point of the river where cattle could cross. The name is generally misleading. The river at this point was not shallow enough for cattle to wade across, as many believed. The river was actually very deep, and in order to ford the river, cattle had either to swim across or be ferried across. And so it was that a ferryman's house and a tavern for weary travelers was built there. Naturally, when the British built the King's Road along the high places from southern Georgia and on to St. Augustine, the roads crossed here, and Jacksonville had its beginnings.
The second royal governor of Florida was brought in just as the revolutionary spirit was catching on in the colonies to the north. Determined to defend East Florida against these Americans, Governor Tunin sought alliance with the Creek Indians. He sailed on the provincial yacht, the St. Lawrence, from Piccolata to the northern shore of the Cowford. It was on this ship, not under the Treaty Oak, as many people believe, that the Creek Indians agreed to fight for the great King of England. 3 treaties were signed. The war erupted shortly thereafter. The main line of defense for the British was the St. Mary's River. The second line of defense was the St. Johns. The East Florida Rangers routinely ventured into Georgia and stole cattle for the British garrison in St. Augustine. One of the more colorful figures who became proficient in this art was Daniel McGirt. Following the war, he returned to his farm on McGirt's Creek, the present-day Ortega River, from where it is rumored he continued his escapades. The only Revolutionary battle fought in Duval County was the Battle of Thomas Creek, now the dividing line between Duval and Nassau counties. Georgia militiamen came into Florida on the King's Road and by way of the Intracoastal Waterway. Several small skirmishes followed involving the militiamen, British regulars, East Florida Rangers, and Indian warriors. Although the Loyalists fought successfully to keep the rebels from taking East Florida, any British longings for an uneventful future were shattered with the signing of a treaty between Great Britain and Spain. The Floridas were returned to the Spanish in 1783, marking the beginning of a second Spanish period. But the Spanish sovereignty had trouble enforcing law and order in the Floridas. Lawlessness and revolution were rampant. Sir Gregor McGregor, one of the many pirates who came into northeast Florida during this period, was sent by a number of revolutionary governments in South America to take Florida away from the Spanish. He captured a little place at the northern banks of the river called the Cowford in June 1817. U.S. troops were sent down by President James Monroe to protect the borders. Major General Andrew Jackson was directed to raise troops to support efforts on the east coast of Florida and to conduct operations in the western panhandle. Jackson undertook the mission with enthusiasm, perhaps too enthusiastically. Jackson raised 1,000 Tennessee volunteers, partially financed with his own funds. En route to Florida, he added to his forces Georgia militiamen and Creek Indians. On Monroe's orders, he entered Florida, chased Seminole warriors into West Florida, captured a number of forts, and by the end of May had taken Pensacola. Confrontations ended in February 1819 when the Adams-Onis Treaty was signed. With this treaty, the United States acquired Florida in return for giving up claims to Texas and for agreeing to pay Spanish debts owed to U.S. citizens. In 1821, President Monroe rewarded Jackson for his initiatives by appointing him the first U.S. governor of Florida. Citizens had been talking about founding a town, and Isaiah D. Hart suggested that it be on the undeveloped land on the north side of the St. Johns. A 20-block town was planned. Citizens named it Jacksonville, in honor of Major General Andrew Jackson. With a population of about 100 people, residents petitioned Secretary of State Adams to designate Jacksonville as a port of entry for foreign trade. This date, June 15, 1822, is accepted as the founding date of the city. The little settlement at the bend of the St. Johns River was now a respectable community. Jacksonville had come of age. Interest in surrounding areas of Jacksonville had been growing too. John Houston McIntosh, a wealthy East Florida planter, owned plantations on Fort George Island and what is now known as Ortega. After killing Alexander Hamilton in a duel in New York and having nearly drowned in a hurricane near Little St. Simon's Island, Aaron Burr visited McIntosh on Fort George Island. While at the plantation, Burr drafted a letter to East Florida Governor Enrique White. No one knows what Burr wanted to discuss with White, but historians speculate that he may have seen an opportunity in East Florida to make a name and a fortune for himself. If so, others had dreams of Florida empire as well. President Madison was instrumental in sending agents into Florida and creating the Patriots' Revolt of 1811, an attempt to capture Florida for the United States. Fort San Nicolas, the site of the present-day athletic field at Bishop Kenny High School, was an important fortification during this uprising. In 1813, Zephaniah Kingsley moved to Fort George Island to farm. He leased and later purchased the property from McIntosh. Although he grew cotton, citrus, and a variety of vegetables, Kingsley's main business was slave trading. He transported slaves from the African coast to Florida, where he trained them in handicrafts and a variety of skills before smuggling them across the border to sell. Although an advocate of slavery, Kingsley's own wife, Anna High, the daughter of an African king, was herself black. Kingsley and his family received so much criticism from the local community, he moved his wife and children to a plantation in Haiti in 1836. Kingsley wrote in his will, "I do also solemnly enjoin my colored and natural children, that seeing the illiberal and inequitable laws of this territory will not afford to them and to their children the protection and justice which is due in civilized society to every human being." He went on to direct his heirs to maintain a will and to find some land of liberty and equal rights, where the conditions of society are governed by some law less absurd than that of color. Kingsley had not found that to be true here. In the late 1830s, Jacksonville began to be known as a health resort, and by mid-century was experiencing significant growth as a trade center. Business activity included shipping, cotton, and timber. Jacksonville was changing and growing, and its population was expanding. Sailing ships and steamers dotted the horizon. The first public schools were opened. William John Mills and other residents began lobbying Tallahassee to incorporate Jacksonville, believing the town would not flourish otherwise. The charter was approved, and Mills was elected the first mayor in 1832. A native of St. Augustine, he fought for what he believed in. He promoted a lottery as a scheme to raise money to complete construction on the courthouse. Even though the town charter prohibited gambling, He voted to approve the incorporation of St. John's Parish in 1834, and he vehemently opposed statehood. Two obstacles stood in the way of Florida becoming a state: a small population and a tax base too low to operate a state government. Apparently, residents of Florida were reluctant to pay taxes even then. But in 1845, a referendum was authorized and statehood was approved. Mills left Duval County for California, claiming that Florida was becoming too civilized. During this period, two Seminole wars had been fought. The Seminole Indians were known for fighting when they wanted to fight and hiding when they didn't. By 1842, with no Seminole chiefs available to sign a peace treaty, the war was declared over. With the end of the war, the prosperity that had previously eluded Jacksonville arrived with the influx of settlers and a growing number of tourists. Hotels and boarding houses were built. The Judson House was built in 1852 on the corner of Bay and Julia Streets at the time when Bay Street was within a block of the St. Johns River, unlike today.
You see, my family had been already here before there was a Jacksonville. It was known as Cowford from its British days. But in the early days, because that river was there and because we had a reasonably warm climate, Jacksonville became the tourist city of the United States. It was not the furthest south city. St. Augustine was, but Jacksonville had the river. St. Augustine did not. So Jacksonville became the Mecca of not just the United States, but people from Paris and London came here to enjoy the winters and the sunshine.
Tourism began to flourish, but any promises of a peaceful and prosperous future were once again interrupted. With pre-war tensions mounting, Florida seceded from the Union in 1861, and Confederates began fortifying the St. Johns River. Sherman and his Union troops landed at Mayport Mills, threatening to capture Jacksonville. There was a panic in the town. Ferry boats were converted into gunboats. Fire was exchanged. And on February 20th, 1864, the most significant battle of the Civil War fought in Florida occurred in the pine forest east of Lake City. Given the length of time and the number of casualties, the Battle of Olustee was the bloodiest battle of this war between the states. Wounded soldiers were taken to Jacksonville, where temporary hospitals were set up in churches and homes. Union soldiers occupied the town. In a military communique, Jacksonville was described as pathetically dilapidated, a mere skeleton of its former self. A military transport carrying the baggage and camp equipment of Union soldiers struck a torpedo near Mandarin Point. The Maple Leaf sank in 20 feet of water, where it remains today, buried in the muddy bottom of the St. Johns River. By the summer of 1864, the war was virtually over in East Florida. Jacksonville, a victim. Federal engineers began repairing the railroads and restringing telegraph lines. The Civil War was ending, and the tourists began returning. The beauty of the river and the appealing climate did bring many visitors to Jacksonville, including soldiers from the war, now returning with their families. Great hotels offering fine food and good music were built. The St. James Hotel, which stood where the St. James Building is today, was one of the finest tourist hotels in the United States, as well as the Windsor, the Grand National, and the Carlton House. The 1876 City Directory listed 12 hotels and 36 boarding houses. Famous visitors were not uncommon. Harriet Beecher Stowe spent many winters at her family residence in Mandarin. Steamboats were known to stop routinely so visitors could catch a glimpse of her. General Robert E. Lee arrived aboard a steamboat in 1870, and Stephen Crane came to Jacksonville to await passage to Cuba on the ill-fated Commodore, which produced his famous short story, The Open Boat. While in Jacksonville, Crane met and fell in love with Cora Taylor, hostess of the Hotel des Dreams, who later became his wife. Frederick Delius arrived from England in 1884 to try his hand at raising oranges, but it was music, not farming, that enamored Delius with his surroundings. Listening to blacks singing in the romantic surrounds of the St. Johns River, Delius first felt the urge to express himself in music. Although it was some years later in Europe that Delius composed the haunting bittersweet themes of the Florida Suite, it was the memory of the river and his love for the people which produced it. Jacksonville was then known as the most frequented resort in Florida. Pablo Beach, later renamed Jacksonville Beach, opened as a tourist resort in the 1880s. Riverboats traveled the St. Johns, and schooners could be seen anchored along the wharves to receive cargoes of oranges, turpentine, and cotton. Jacksonville was also an established industrial center, boasting 5 lumber mills, 2 brick yards, and 14 cigar factories. 14,000 tourists were reported in 1870. The number increased to nearly 50,000 by 1875. The population doubled and sometimes tripled during the winter months. Although the railroad had helped to establish Jacksonville as the tourist city in the country, it also contributed to its demise.
At the time, a man by the name of Mr. Flagler, who is well known these days, came in and built a railroad, the Florida East Coast Railway. And he built the bridge, which is runs right along parallel to the Acosta Bridge. That railroad bridge was the first crossing of the St. Johns by any kind of a structure. The railroad then was run to St. Augustine, and the Ponte de Leon and the other hotels and buildings were built by Flagler down there, and the tourists started going to St. Augustine, and before long the railway inched its way on down to what is now Daytona, West Palm Beach, and eventually reached Key West, you know, over the years. So Jacksonville became a non-tourist town.
As the tourists began moving farther into South Florida, city leaders tried to rekindle interest in the area by sponsoring a subtropical exposition. Colonel J.J. Daniel, who helped recreate the Board of Trade, now the Chamber of Commerce, was instrumental in putting together the exposition of 1888. President Grover Cleveland and his wife attended the exposition in February of that year. A reception at the St. James Hotel brought out so many people who wanted to shake the president's hand, the access from the street to the hotel literally collapsed from the wait. During the exposition, a fever of unknown origin began spreading throughout the city. Several people died before it was diagnosed. By August, it became evident that Jacksonville was in the throes of a yellow fever epidemic. In an effort to fight this mysterious disease, cannons were fired, hoping that the concussion would kill the germs. Pine wood and tar were burned, blanketing the town with thick smoke to purify the air. People were moved into temporary camps outside the city, and fumigation stations were set up to handle the outgoing mail. A search for the cause of the epidemic seemed to point everywhere except at the mosquito. By December, over 4,000 people had contracted the disease. 427 had died. Freezing November temperatures finally brought an end to this terrible ordeal. But the combination of the railroad moving south and the effects of the epidemic had dealt its fatal blow to tourism. Jacksonville residents had witnessed many changes and faced many challenges over the years. As the turn of the century approached, new challenges awaited.